Chapter 19 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 19, in which are conflicting forces. One of the marked features of my changed feelings during those days was my aversion for Mrs. Tyndall. It grew upon me, which was no wonder, for I nursed it as a virtuous thing. I would not tolerate the slightest interference from her. Indeed, I named her most innocent and kindly words after that title. I really wonder at her patience with my lofty airs, and often sharp words. I remember how vexed I was to discover that Dr. Douglass by no means approved of this marked change. "I don't understand you in the least," I said to him one evening, speaking irritably. "There seems to be no such thing as pleasing you. When I was allowing Mrs. Tyndall to lead me in any direction that she chose, you were always looking grave and disturbed over it. And now that I am trying to break away from her influence, and be myself, you seem equally out of sorts about it." "No, Julia," he answered gravely, "I am not sorry that you do not yield to her influence as you formerly did. I am only sorry for the manner in which you exhibit the change. You seem almost bitter in your feeling toward Mrs. Tyndall, and unjust in your estimate of her." "I am bitter," I said fiercely. "I wonder if I haven't reason. Think what a life she has made me lead. She has interfered with everything that was ever taught me. She has warped my judgment and biased my opinions, and, worse than all, made me neglect my own mother. I can never forgive her for it." "But, Julia," he interposed, with a puzzled and troubled air, "was it absolutely necessary to follow in her footsteps? Had you really no other guide, no other friend?" "It makes no difference whether I had or not," I answered moodily. "I followed her at any rate." "But I think it makes great difference, and herein lies your mistake. You are blaming Mrs. Tyndall instead of your own heart. You are indulging in bitter, unchristian feelings toward her, instead of going to the fountainhead of all the trouble, and laying bare your own heart." "She has been a professor of religion for a good many years. She ought to have set me a better example." "Suppose she had done so, is there any certainty you would have followed it? Was there no other example than hers to follow?" "Oh, yes," I said angrily. "I might have followed yours. I suppose that is what you mean." To this I received no answer, other than a reproachful look from grave, sad eyes. Then he asked me in gentle, tender tones: "Do you find rest and peace in your religion nowadays, Julia? Do you find comfort in prayer?" "No, I do not," I answered, with quivering lip. "I try to pray, and it seems to me that I can't. I am not at rest at all. I don't know anything about peace. My heart is all wrong, and I can't get it right." I finished the sentence with a sob. My heart was very sore. All my efforts at reform, either in myself or others, seemed to end in failure, and sometimes I was half angry, and sometimes my heart felt as if it were broken. The doctor answered me gently: "No, poor child, you can't. If I were you, I would not try any longer. It would do no good if you were to keep trying for 100 years." I turned to him, great astonishment in my voice. "Doctor, what do you mean?" "Why, my dear child, don't you see you have reached the very center of all the trouble? Your heart is all wrong, and you can't make it right. Why should you try? Why not take it to Jesus, and tell him, 'Here, Lord, is my heart, it is all wrong. I can't do anything with it. Create in me a clean heart, and renew a right spirit within me.'" My tone and manner of speech had changed very much during the last few sentences that I had spoken. One of those sudden moods to which I was subject during those days had swept over me, and my heart seemed melted. I think I was honestly trying to get into the light, and stumbling over my own blind self. I had a letter that evening which had much to do with all the after years of my life. Dr. Douglass sent it up to me when he stopped on his way to prayer meeting; sent that, and a renewed request that I would go out with him to the meeting. But I shrank from that. I distrusted my own nerves, and dreaded above all things a show of feeling that would draw me into notice. His request irritated me, perhaps because my conscience desired to avoid the matter, and I gave a very decided refusal, and sat down with ruffled feelings to my letter, indifferent as to who had written it, since the penmanship was neither Sadie's nor Alfred's. It ran thus: Dear Cousin Julia, Mama and Papa are going West, for Papa's health. Brother Ralph and his wife are in Europe, you know, and I am still to be disposed of. The question is, whither shall I go? I want to come to you, share your room and your bed and your heart. May I come? Coax your hostess for me. We ought to love each other more, you and I, because of our dear Esther. That is, you ought to love me very much more than you do. I love you enough already. How our friends are gathering home! I want to see you and talk with you about them. How glad Esther must have been to welcome Auntie. I wonder if she is acquainted with Mr. Foster now. I have only one treasure, my very own, you know, waiting for me. While why, you are rich. Uncle and Auntie and 2 sisters and the little Minnie. Isn't it nice to think you will have to leave none of them down here when you go home? I like that thought. I was sorry not to be with you when you laid Auntie's body to rest. That is, somewhat sorry. Not so very sorry, you know, because I remember her face as it was when I saw her last, and you know she will look ever so much more like that when I see her again than she will like the coffined face that, in spite of yourself, comes in between you and your mother in heaven. I know how that is. The veil of the flesh is sometimes heavy, but it lifts, and, my darling, there is glory behind it. I want to come to you. I think very likely we need each other. I want to come just as soon as I can. I want you to run down now, this minute, just as soon as you finish your letter, and coax your I've forgotten her name, to take me to board. Tell her you want me, you know. You do, don't you? Write to me this evening when you have come back to your room, then I shall have your letter on Thursday, and if it is such a letter as I think you will write, such a letter as I want you to write, why, then you will have me on the following Tuesday. Your loving Cousin Abbie. It was certainly a very strange letter of condolence. Indeed, you see, there was no pity or sympathy expressed, or apparently felt. Yet it touched me as none of the good, kind, well-meaning, terrible letters that I had received since my mother's death had begun to do. Yes, I certainly wanted her. I had not realized it before. I had not thought of her at all, but that letter made me feel as though she were just the thing for which I had been longing and craving. I went down with the letter in my hand to Mrs. Tyndall. She was lounging on the sofa in the library, and her husband was lounging in an easy-chair beside her. They were laughing when I came in, but they checked their mirth as if they must not laugh in my presence. I did not need these constant reminders that my mother was dead. I told my errand briefly and somewhat stiffly, not at all in the coaxing way that Abbie had probably imagined. Mrs. Tyndall laughingly addressed her husband. I declare, Mr. Tyndall, I believe we shall have to open a boarding-house in self-defense. This is the 3rd application that I have had lately. Julia, I would do almost anything for you, and I feel peculiarly anxious to help you now in your sorrow. But it does not seem quite the thing for me to go to taking boarders. You know I hardly consider Dr. Douglas and yourself in that light. Who is this cousin of yours? I had a weapon to make use of that I considered more effective than any coaxings of mine. I briefly produced it now. She is the only daughter of Mr. Ralph Ried of New York City. Mrs. Tyndall's eyes brightened. She sat up with sudden energy. Not Ralph Ried of the firm of Ried, Wilkinson and Company? Yes, ma'am, that is Uncle Ralph's business address. Why, how very singular! Mr. Tyndall has had business dealings with him for years, and I saw him myself once. He is an immensely rich man, even as New York people count riches. And this young lady is his daughter? Why have you never told me before? I do not remember that you ever asked me, I said with exceeding stiffness. Whereat she laughed pleasantly and continued her catechism. What is this young lady like? What have I heard about her? Mr. Tyndall, don't you remember the Arlingtons told us of her? She was disappointed matrimonially or something of that sort, wasn't she? Her intended husband was killed but a few hours before their marriage was to have taken place, I explained. Oh, yes, I remember. How very sad. Does she wear a widow's dress? No. Well, it wouldn't be wise, might interfere with future marriages. Well, Julia, under the peculiar circumstances, I might let her come for a while. I suppose there is really no reason why I shouldn't, only it is rather funny. I had had not a shadow of doubt as to my success from the moment that she had exclaimed, "Not Ralph Ried of the firm of Ried, Wilkinson & Company." So I went away without exhibiting much elation over my success, and wrote my letter to Abbie. Then I waited for her with some impatience and a great deal of curiosity. I had not seen her since my sister Esther's death 6 years before. I remembered her very vividly as she was then, but now I reflected she was 24 years old. It seemed an age fraught with dignity. I more than half expected to be afraid of her. I made great preparations for meeting her at the depot, enlisting Dr. Douglas into the service, who most unqualifiedly approved of the expected arrival. But she came unexpectedly after all. My cousin Abbie always did and always will do unexpected things. I came home from the shop a little earlier than usual on the day in which we were looking for her, and hastened at once to my room, eager to have it properly garnished in her honor. The moment I opened the door, 2 small soft hands were placed over my eyes, and I was kissed, mouth and nose and chin, little gleeful laughs issuing meanwhile from the sweet lips of the kisser. At last she released me, and stood back for a more artistic view, so she said. "Yes, you look like her, you certainly do," she said at last, in a bright, eager voice. "I was afraid you wouldn't, but you do very much." "Look like whom?" I said at last, wonderingly. "Esther. You see, I wanted you to resemble her, because it would seem so natural. She and I spent so many happy hours together, and now you and I are going to." This seemed strange to me. I had rarely heard my sister Esther mentioned during those years, and when she had been, it was in a solemn tone, as one who was dead, gone out of our life, away from our interests, to be spoken of no more. I remember I thought then that Abbie spoke of her more as we would of one who had gone to Europe to live, than as one who had died. When we went down to tea, I smiled to think of Mrs. Tyndall's conception of her in widow's weeds, she looked so bright and fresh, her fair hair still clung in rings about her head, and her dress, of soft clinging material, was as blue as the sky, and fitted to her fairy-like form to perfection. She looked and seemed not a day older than I remembered her as a child. Her reception of Mrs. Tyndall's graceful courtesies was sweet and sunny. I frowned upon them, and inwardly resolved that she should not be deceived as I had been. "I will tell her all about that woman to-night," I said to myself in an emphatic manner. Mr. Sayles was present, and Abbie chatted with him in the free, frank way that it was her nature to assume. While we loitered at the table, the church bells rang. "Do you have meeting this evening?" Abbie asked of me with brightening eyes. "Is it your church bell? Why, wouldn't that be a pleasant omen to attend a prayer meeting on the first evening of my arrival?" Dr. Douglas explained that they were holding a series of meetings, in which subject she at once became deeply interested. "Isn't it time to go?" she questioned as we still lingered. "Oh, no, I am not in the least tired. I rested nicely last night. I always do on the cars. I shall like to go very much." "The little enthusiast," Mr. Sayles said, laughing. They were talking about her still when I went back to search for my handkerchief, and as I opened the door, I heard him say that, in an amused tone, "The little enthusiast! It is really refreshing to hear her talk." Then to me, "Miss Julia, I have promised to conduct your little cousin and yourself to church this evening, if you will allow. Dr. Douglas was obliged to go out professionally, and deputized me." Mrs. Tyndall laughed. "You must tell a straighter story than that," she said gaily, "if you want Julia to believe you. Julia, he offered his services to take you to church, and the doctor looked amazed, as well he might. I think the millennium must be coming." "Or the days of witchcraft returning," Mr. Tyndall said, amusedly. Chapter 20.